Erev Tov Rabotai, we're continuing with our Mishna Yomi, Masechet Shabbat. We're up to Perek Tetvav, Mishnah Gimel. Today's Mishnah should be Leilu Nishmat, Neria ben Svelana Aranbaev, and Eliyahu ben Burcha Israelov, Menuchatam Began Eden, Amen. From this Mishnah to the end of the Masechet, the main subject is going to be Isur D'Rabbanan, rabbinic prohibitions. Now the Tosfot Yom Tov explains in connection with the previous Mishnah yesterday, which mentioned how a person ties some types of clothing. This Mishnah discusses folding clothes. Now, as a disclaimer for today's Mishnah, and in general, when we learn the Mishnayot, we are not learning the practical halacha. We are learning the Mishnah that the Gemara dissects then and tries to understand further. For the practical halacha for today, what to do, you must always ask your local Orthodox rabbi or look in the Shulchan Aruch with the commentaries, the Mishnah Berurah, the Yekut Yosef, the Kaf HaChaim, etc. We are learning now the Mishnah. So the Mishnah begins, Mekaplin et hakelim afilu arba v'chamisha pa'amim. One may fold clothes even 4 or 5 times on Shabbat so that they will not become wrinkled and will be fit to worn again that Shabbat. Umatzin et hamitod milele Shabbat leShabbat, and one may make beds after sleeping in them on the night of Shabbat, Friday night, to prepare them to be slept in again on Shabbat. Avalo mishabbat lemotzi Shabbat. However, one may not fold clothes or make beds on Shabbat for use after Shabbat, because it is forbidden to make preparations on Shabbat for another day. Now the Mefarshim explain, after taking off the garment, one may fold it, and if he is not satisfied with the way it was folded the first time, he may fold it again as many times as he wants, provided he intends to wear the garment that Shabbat. That's what the Meiri explains when we say you can fold it even 4 or 5 times. Now the Gemara in Masechet Shabbat, page 113a, as brought down by the Rav, states that in most cases folding clothes is forbidden because it resembles the biblical transgression of repairing a utensil. It is permitted only if all of the following conditions are met. A, one person folds the garment and not 2, because 2 people will stretch the cloth and smooth out all the wrinkles. B, the garment must be new, meaning not yet laundered, because a new garment is stiffer than an old one and does not get as wrinkled in the first place. C, the garment must be white and not colored, because the folding of a colored garment improves its appearance to a greater extent. And D, one has nothing else to wear, in which case he needs to fold his clothes so that he will have neat clothes to wear in honor of Shabbat. Again, reading the Mishnah with the commentaries for practical halacha, that's another topic. Now, the Mishnah states the law for folding clothes and making beds on Yom Kippur that falls on a Friday. Now, the commentaries explain, in those times when the beginning of each month depended on the sighting of the new moon, it was possible for Yom Kippur to fall on a Friday or Sunday. But according to the fixed calendar that we currently use, which was adapted at the times of the Moed, this can never happen. But again, we're learning the Mishnah. Rabbi Yishmael says, Mikapelin et hakelim umatzin et hamitod miyom kippurim leShabbat. One may fold clothes and make beds on Yom Kippur that falls on a Friday for use on Shabbat, because Yom Kippur is a weekday in relation to Shabbat, meaning Rabbi Yishmael says it possesses less sanctity than Shabbat, and therefore one may make preparations on Yom Kippur for Shabbat. And the Mefarshim explain, if one desecrates Shabbat in the presence of 2 witnesses who warned him not to do it and told him of the punishment that it carries, he is liable to execution, God forbid. Whereas one who desecrates Yom Kippur is liable to karet, which the Tosfot Yom Tov says is a less severe punishment. Now, this difference shows that Shabbat has more sanctity than Yom Kippur, such that Yom Kippur can be viewed as a weekday in comparison. Therefore, although one is normally prohibited to prepare things on Yom Kippur for use after Yom Kippur, Rabbi Yishmael says one may prepare on Yom Kippur for Shabbat. Now, the Art School Elucidator brings down a nice introduction before we continue in the Mishnah. Rabbi Yishmael continues with another application of this rule, that Yom Kippur is less sacred than Shabbat. The laws of the temple service state that the fats of an offering may be burned on the altar even during the night that follows the day in which the offering was brought, meaning the commentators explain, an offering must be slaughtered in the daytime and its blood must be applied to the altar the same day, also in the daytime. However, the parts of the offering that are burned on the altar may be placed the following night as well. Now, the parts burned on the altar are generally referred to as the fats because they consist primarily of animal fats, chelav. Now, this is true for most offerings, with the exception of the olaf offering, the thanks offering, which is burned in its entirety. Now, the fats, however, of a Friday offering may not be burned on Friday night Shabbat, because it's prohibited to desecrate Shabbat for an offering brought on a day of lesser sanctity. Now, similarly, the fats of an offering brought the day before Yom Kippur may not be offered that night on Yom Kippur. But Rabbi Ishmael's statement now concerns the case of Yom Kippur falling on a Sunday. Shabbat kerevin b'Yom Kippurim. And if Yom Kippur falls on a Sunday, the fats of the Shabbat offering may be offered on the altar after Shabbat, even though it's the night of Yom Kippur, because Shabbat has greater sanctity than Yom Kippur, again, like Rabbi Ishmael holds. Like we said, yes. Shabbat kerevin b'Yom Kippurim. Okay, however, Rabbi Akiva disagrees. He says, Lo shel Shabbat kerevim b'Yom Kippurim. If Yom Kippur falls on a Sunday, the fats of the Shabbat offerings may not be offered on the night of Yom Kippur. Velo shel Yom Kippurim kerevim b'Shabbat. And if Yom Kippur falls on a Friday, the fats of the Yom Kippur offerings may not be offered on the night of Shabbat, Friday night, because the Torah regards them as though they have equal sanctity. Now, Rabbi Akiva accepts that Shabbat carries greater sanctity than Yom Kippur, but nevertheless he learns from a pasuk in the Torah that the offerings of Shabbat may not be burned in Yom Kippur, which implies that Shabbat may not be treated as more sacred than Yom Kippur. Rabbi Akiva, the commentaries say, also disagrees with Rabbi Ishmael's ruling that one may fold clothes and make beds in Yom Kippur for Shabbat, since Rabbi Akiva holds that Yom Kippur must be treated as the equal of Shabbat with regards to offerings which are holy. Kol sheken, it must certainly be treated as equal to Shabbat with regards to mundane activities, and the Rav tells us, V'halacha ki Rabbi Akiva, the halacha follows the opinion of Rabbi Akiva. That is in Rabotai of chapter 15, Mishnah Gimel. We continue now with chapter 16, Mishnah 1, Perek Tet Zayin, Mishnah Aleph. Now, as an introduction, God forbid, when a fire breaks out, it's the natural instinct of people to put it out to save their possessions. Now, the sages were therefore concerned that when a fire breaks out on Shabbat, people in their anxiety to save all their possessions might forget the laws of Shabbat and put out the fire. And we know extinguishing a fire is one of the forbidden menachot of Shabbat, like we saw in chapter 7, Mishnah 2. Therefore, the sages decreed that a person may not save his possessions from a fire on Shabbat, except for certain articles, among which are the books of scriptures, literally scrolls of Tanakh. Now, the following Mishnah deals with the laws of saving such books from a fire. Kol kitvei HaKodesh, all books of scripture, namely Torah, Nevi'im, prophets, and Ketuvim writings, which Ketuvim include the books of Tanakh from Tilim through Divrei Yamim, Psalm to Chronicles. Matzilin otan mipnei adileka, they may be saved from fire on Shabbat. Now the commentaries add only books of scripture written in Hebrew and in Ktav Ashurit, the script used in Sefer Torah, are included in this leniency because only these have special sanctity. But again, they may be saved from a fire on Shabbat, meaning we may remove them from a burning house or courtyard to save them from being destroyed. Even though the sages prohibited saving general property from fire on Shabbat, they permitted saving books of scripture because of their sanctity. And for this reason, the commentaries write, they permitted carrying them out of a burning courtyard, even into another courtyard that had not joined with this one in an Eruvei Chatzirot before Shabbat, because since carrying from one courtyard to another without an Eruvei Chatzirot is only rabbinically prohibited, the sages relaxed this prohibition for the sake of saving books of scripture from destruction. But now, until this point, Ben shekorin bahen uben she'en korin bahen. The Mishnah says these may be saved whether they are books in which we read on Shabbat publicly, such as prophets Haftarah, from which we read the Haftarot in the synagogue, and for sure Sifrei Torah, Esevot Torah, uben she'en korin bahen, or whether they are books from which even individuals do not read on Shabbat, such as Ketuvim. Now the Mishnah is going to explain later on why they're not read on Shabbat. But until this point, we have been dealing with books of scripture written in the original Hebrew. The Mishnah now discusses the rules regarding books translated and written in other languages. Now, the Gemara in Masechet Shabbat, page 115a, explains that the Mishnah is actually missing words at this point. Chisur mechsera, as they called. It should be read like this: all books of scripture may be saved from a fire on Shabbat, whether we read them such as prophets or whether we do not read them such as Ketuvim. When is this true? When they are written in Hebrew. However, when they are written in other languages, they may not be saved from fire on Shabbat. The Mishnah continues, however, even when they are written in any language besides Hebrew, so that they may not be used and may not, so that they may not be used and may not be safe from a fire on Shabbat, which again, the Rav explains that this follows the opinion of Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel in Mishnah Masechet Megillah, chapter 1, Mishnah 8, who prohibits reading from books of scriptures written in languages other than Hebrew. You have to see that Mishnah over there. But since it's forbidden to use them, they may not be saved on Shabbat. But nevertheless, te'onim gniza, they still require storing at other times, meaning they may not simply be abandoned, but they must be put away in a safe place to prevent their desecration. And nowadays, when it has become permissible to write scripture in other languages, and so many Jews do not understand Hebrew, it's also permitted to save such translations as well as other Torah works from a fire on Shabbat, as Shulchan Aruch writes in Orach Chaim chapter 334, Halakha 12. Now the Mishnah explains why certain books of scriptures are not read on Shabbat. Why do we not read from Ketuvim on Shabbat, like the Mishnah earlier said? Because of neglect of the lecture hall, meaning on Shabbat, lectures would be given for men who were occupied with their work all week and were therefore unable to learn Torah. In these lectures, they would be taught many laws regarding everyday life. The sages prohibited reading the Ketuvim on Shabbat so that people should not become fascinated by the Ketuvim and read them instead of attending the lectures. The Mishnah continues now, Matzilin tik a sefer im a sefer. We may save the case of a sefer Torah together with the sefer Torah itself. V'tika tefillin im a tefillin, and the case of a tefillin together with the tefillin. V'afal pi shesh betuchan ma'ot, even when there is money in them. Now, money may not be moved on Shabbat because it's muktzah. We'll see later on in chapter 21, Mishnah 2. However, if we were to require removing the scroll from the case and then putting it back in after the money was dumped out, much time would be lost and the Sefer Torah film might be burned. The sages therefore permitted taking these with the money in them. Ulechan matzilin otan, to where may be saved, meaning to what place may we transfer books of scripture on Shabbat in order to save them? And the commentators explain this question, that it's obvious that they may not be carried out from a private domain to a public domain on Shabbat, because this involves a biblical prohibition which may be transgressed only when a life is in danger. But for the sake of saving books of scripture, the sages permitted overriding certain rabbinic prohibitions. So which of these is permitted in order to save holy objects from fire? The Mishnah says, "Lemavoy she'eno mefulash," to an alley that is not open, meaning even to an alley that has walls on three sides and the fourth side closed by just one post, what we call alechi. And the Mefarshim explain, at the time of the Mishnah, several houses would open into a courtyard, several courtyards would open into an alley, and the alleys would open into the public domain. When a fire breaks out in a house or courtyard and there is a danger that it will spread throughout the courtyard, there is need to carry the books of scripture into the alley. An alley enclosed by three walls and open on the fourth side is biblically considered a private domain, and one may carry from a courtyard into it, but the rabbis prohibited carrying into the alley unless its entrance is enclosed by a post called a lechi, which serves as a token partition for that side. Now our Mishnah follows the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer in Mishnah Masechet Eruvin, chapter 1, Mishnah 2, that two posts are needed to enclose an alley properly, one on each side of the entrance. However, for the sake of saving books of scripture, he permits carrying them out into an alley that has just one post, and that's what the Mishnah says. Ulechan matzilin otan, to where may we save them. Lemavoy she'eno mefulash, to an alley that is not open, meaning an alley that has walls on three sides, and the fourth side is closed by just one post. Ben Betera omer af lamfulash. Ben Betera says, even to an open alley, meaning even to an alley that has no post at all on the fourth side, as long as it has three walls, since even this is considered a private domain on the biblical level. And the Rav says, "Ven halacha ke ben betera," the halacha does not follow ben betera. And that is the Rabotai of today's Mishna Yomi. Baruch Adonai leolam, amen v'amen.